Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference, Optimizing Permitting for MRE through Data Transferability. With that, I'll turn the call over to Andrea Copping, Senior Research Scientist. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is Andrea Copping at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I have here with me my team, Michaela Freeman and Alicia Gorton, working on this work of data transferability. This webinar is brought to you by Annex IV, which is a task under the Ocean Energy Systems Collaboration of Nations working towards establishing, developing the marine renewable energy industry. And today, what we want to do is talk about the work we've been doing to optimize permitting or consenting through a process we're calling data transferability. Next slide, please. Today's webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about purpose and introduce the topic. Michaela is going to talk about the outreach and engagement activities we've been carrying out this past year or so. I'll cover some of the sort of details of the data transferability process in the various steps there, and then tell you what we intend next. Next slide, please. So the backstory to this is we continue to see barriers to permitting or consenting and getting wave and tidal devices in the water. This is based on the fact that the marine renewable energy industry has the perspective that it takes a long time to permit or consent these devices, that they are and that the permitting processes are quite complicated. They perceive they are being asked to provide a great deal of data for both baseline and post-installation monitoring, and they're concerned that there will be future mitigation requests, all of this amounting to a lot of strain on an industry that is not established and working on very, very fine financial margins at best. At the same time, the regulatory community in the U.S. and abroad is concerned that these are new devices being put in new spaces in the ocean, and they know little about their potential effects. In fact, broadly, we don't know as much as we'd like to about environmental effects, although our base of knowledge is growing and is quite substantial at this point. It's also important to recognize that the regulatory community's real job is to protect the marine environment and to follow all applicable federal, state, regional, and so on laws and regulations. So in an attempt to address these barriers and these perceptions, the Annex IV work group has been spent this past year on what we're calling data transferability and data collection consistency. And that's what we're going to go into here. It's kind of a mouthful. And so another way to think about this is learning as we go. I do want to note that we are very interested in your thoughts and perceptions as we go forward. So please do provide comments or questions in the chat box as you think of them. We did not ask everyone to introduce themselves this time because there's a few too many people on the line, but if you wish to introduce yourself through the chat box and your interests, we'd be very happy to see that as well. Okay, next slide, please. The data transferability and environmental interactions work that we've been doing. In a nutshell, what we're trying to do is create a process for using data from already permitted or consented projects to inform future projects. Imagine a regulator receiving an application for a waiver title development. There is little for that regulator to go on to really understand what kinds of interactions might occur, what sort of monitoring should take place, and it's that process we're really trying to do something about. It's also important to note that other analogous industries, other industries in the ocean, near shore, rivers, etc., may provide some really good information about potential environmental effects. And using that kind of data and transferring it to these newer projects really allows the regulatory community, the development community, and the research community to focus on those really important unknowns that are really specific to the marine renewable energy industry. So I want to pause for a second and address this data word. We've referred to data, and this could be raw or quality controlled data, but more likely it will be different types of information. It could be analyzed data, it could be synthetic data sets put together for specific purposes, it could be reports, videos, audio files. Think of the sort of thing you would provide to a regulator as part of an application. Now, in working through these processes, we have focused on 6 environmental interactions, and these are drawn from the experience we've had so far, drawing from the 2016 Annex IV State of the Science report and other research outcomes. Collision risk, of course, is the one that continues to really be difficult for tidal and river turbines, the collision risk to marine animals. Underwater noise can occur from either wave devices or tidal devices and may interrupt communication, navigation, etc. Electromagnetic field. For those animals in the ocean that are sensitive, the concerns are it may cause them to change their behavior, interrupt their movement. Changes in habitat, be it benthic habitat or water column habitat, or changes in by placing devices in the water that cause animals to reef and hang around shoal. Displacement or barrier effects. This is one that we have little insight into and won't until we have a lot of devices in the water. The concern is that with many, many devices in the water, it may interrupt patterns of movement, particularly for migratory animals, causing them to not get easily to their preferred habitats. And the 6th one is changes in physical systems, changes in circulation or wave heights and intensity because devices have been placed in the ocean, interrupting flow, but also removing energy. So that's sort of the background to this. Now, I want to turn it over to Michaela, who is going to go through the background that we've spent some time with the regulatory community, largely in the U.S. to date. Michaela.
Next slide, please, Bob. All right, so over the past year or so, as Andrea mentioned, we've been working with the regulatory community, and specifically in the U.S., we've held 2 webinars on these environmental interactions, and we also conducted a survey with U.S. regulators where we really wanted to focus on data transferability, how familiar regulators are with the marine renewable energy technologies and interactions so that we can really tailor the work that we do to be helpful and useful for this community. One of the few big things we found with this survey is we found a varying degrees of familiarity with these technologies, which can be expected because they are new in the water. We haven't seen a lot of them, especially in the U.S. The other thing we found is we asked regulators if they were willing to use this data or information from one project that's already been permitted or consented for a future project in their jurisdiction. And this graph on the right here shows that overall there was a real interest could be done as both federal and state regulators either said that this maybe could be done or absolutely could be done. So we took this as a really great sign that data could be transferred from things that Andrea mentioned, research studies, monitoring of already permitted projects, as well as analogous industries. So following that, we conducted a literature review and wrote a white paper particularly to learn from other industries about data transferability and to develop our own framework, which Andrea will get into a little bit later. We then held a series of workshops for U.S. regulators, both in person and online by region. Particularly, we shared some example data that's been collected around these wave entitled devices, and I'm going to show you a few examples of these in the next few slides. And we really tried to understand what regulators' needs are and their willingness to share data and transfer data between projects. And then we also really wanted to gather feedback on our framework that we put together. Following that, to reach out to the broader marine renewable energy community, we held an international workshop that expanded to regulators, developers, consultants, researchers for additional feedback on this process, as well as feedback on our best management practices we developed, and helping us put together what will become our implementation plan. Consistent with this webinar, we also held another webinar last month for U.S. regulators to really circle back with them, get feedback on what we had developed since we last talked to them, and just continue this iterative process. Next slide, please, Bob. as I mentioned, I wanted to show some examples of the data we shared during the U.S. Working groups with regulators because we think these are really great examples of what sort of information and data we're talking about sharing throughout this process and what this could look like. So this first video, which I'll show you in a moment, is from a tidal turbine at the European Marine Energy Centre in northern Scotland. It's the voice turbine. You can see this at the bottom here, and we'll go ahead and play this video. So what you're looking at here is you're seeing the turbine moving, and it's moving quite slow, which shows that it's different from conventional hydropower or ship propellers. And we can see fish here in the upper left camera who are swimming around and aren't really bothered by the turbine. So the next thing I want to show you is on this right here is the open hydro turbine, also deployed at the European Marine Energy Centre. It's pictured here up on its research platform. In a minute, I'm going to show you an audio clip, but I want you to look at the graph right below it, which is a sound spectra from what it would look like for the operating turbine, and it shows that the decibel levels are well below those considered harmful, both for harassment and injury for marine mammals and fish. This was really interesting for regulators to see that this would be below those levels. So now we're going to show you or let you hear an audio clip. And it could be really faint on your computer. Hopefully you guys can hear this. Make sure you're turning your audio up for that one. And what we wanted you to get a sense of with this, hopefully you could hear it, is what an operating turbine can sound like. So do note that the loudness of this clip depends on how loud your speaker is on your computer, and also that this clip was taken underwater and we're playing it in air. So there's, it's not quite realistic, but we just wanted to give regulators an idea of what this noise can sound like. All right, next slide. So again, we wanted to show you some more data. These two here are wave energy converters at the Wave Energy Test Site in Hawaii. On the left is the Fredolson Lifesaver, and below it shows a sound print from the device, which is a different way to show this underwater noise from devices compared to that graph in the last slide. And this shows sound over time. So the y-axis is the frequency, and the x-axis is time. So this is a 30-minute clip of the sound. 30-second, clip of the sound from the wave energy converter. And here you can see that still the amplitude doesn't exceed the levels of concern, but it's quite complex to read this graph. On the right is the NWEI Azura wave device, and we're going to show you a video of the movement and then also show you a sound clip. So here's the video first. And you can see this device is both below water and above water in this clip. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like, what it moves like in the ocean, and then we're going to go over to the audio clip of it. And the audio clip is looped, and again, this will depend on how loud your speakers are. So again, hopefully you can hear it. We are going to post these recordings, and if you couldn't hear it then, check back in with the recordings on the TPIS website and see if you can listen to them there. And so again, this noise is quite low in amplitude. It just gives you an idea of what it might sound like in the water. Next slide. And so the other thing is we also showed outcomes of studies on electromagnetic fields, videos of benthic habitats, modeling studies for changes in physical systems to really show those interactions that Andrea mentioned. And overall, we found that regulators aren't necessarily looking for raw data, but rather just data and information that they can interpret and easily understand. So a good example of that is when they were shown the underwater noise data, most had a preference for that first graph I showed you on the open hydro turbine rather than that second very complex graph from the Fredolson Lifesaver. They also really valued this information as it helped increase their understanding of the potential impacts and the technologies. And really overall, we got some positive feedback on the information as well as this data transferability process that we're putting together. And some main points was that regulators thought it would be very helpful if they could find data and information easier throughout their permitting process. And they really liked the idea of having data that's compatible with one another, which leads into this collection consistency. So Andrea will now take us through this data transferability process. And again, feel free to write any questions you may have in the chat box, and we'll take any questions at the end. Go ahead, Andrea.
Thanks, Michaela. Next slide, please. Okay, Michaela has explained to you how we worked with regulators and got feedback. We got verbal feedback during those workshops. We also asked for written feedback by sending questions ahead of time, following up. So we felt like the regulators had a chance to express themselves, to think about it, to come back to us, and a lot of them did. Really good number did, and we heard a lot of "I'm sharing this with my colleagues" kind of talk, which was great. So taking all that into account, we have developed what we're calling our data transferability process. And we've tried several different ways to graphically show this. This is our current version, sort of the bubble. And what I want to do is sort of take you through the parts of it and explain it without trying to make it too process heavy. So if you go to the next slide, Bob, we'll start with the framework in the middle. The purpose of the framework is really a way for us to bring together data sets from already permitted or consented projects in an organized fashion. We set up a process to compare the applicability of each data set as they're used from consented projects to future projects. It also communicates with the ability to check how consistently the data has been collected, and overall guides this process for data transfer. Now, the way we've done this is we have started, based on our research from other industries and literature sources, we started by defining what we're calling an archetype. If you go to the next slide, Bob. An archetype is if you go to the dictionary, it simply means an imitation of an original or a sort of a typical example. And what we have tried to do is develop a series of archetypes that explain a situation that a regulator might face in a permitting application. And in this particular example, we have many of these. There's 50 or 60 of them, but just to show you one. In this particular case, the stressor of interest is underwater noise. Or I guess it's not. It's collision risk. Sorry, it's collision risk. And we have described in general terms the site conditions in which this might occur. In this case, we've picked a shallow, narrow channel where one might have tidal energy and a tidal turbine. We could have picked a wider channel, a deeper channel, but this is the particular one we've picked here. The technology that we have prescribed for this particular archetype is a bottom-mounted tidal turbine, and the receptor of concern, the animal that might be hurt, is a marine mammal. And with those four descriptors, stressor, site condition, technology, and receptor, we have defined this as a marine renewable energy project archetype. And the reason behind this is really to, as I said, categorize each data set, both in the application that a regulator receives, but also in the data sets he or she might seek for comparison or transfer. If you go to the next slide, Bob. So we put all those archetypes together, and then we also developed within this framework guidelines for transferability. Starting at the top, we felt it was necessary that the two data sets you look at, that which will be in the future project and that from the permitted or consented project, have the same marine renewable energy project archetype, and that the data be collected consistently. And we're going to talk about data consistency in a little bit later. So I thought it's also very important that the projects be of similar size. That is, comparing the project with putting a single turbine or WEC in the water with one with another single turbine or WEC versus an array to an array. Now, the caveat here is that we don't have much information from arrays yet, so this is maybe the future desired guideline. We may have to be extrapolating from single devices to arrays for a little while. Also of importance is that it's the same receptor species, or at least a closely related one. For example, if you had a tidal turbine and concerns about gray seals, those concerns or that data that describes them might be transferable to a similar situation with harbor seals. but it probably would be not very useful trying to look at how gray seals react and how large whales react. So that's what we mean by closely related species. Next, it's nice if it's a similar technology, not just wave and tidal, but supposing you were looking at wave devices, being able to compare potential effects from point absorber to point absorber is probably a little more applicable than point absorber to oscillating water column or bottom-mounted wave device. And then going further down that list of guidelines to something desirable, it's nice if it's got a similar wave or tidal resource. For example, a slower flow tidal, a 1 meter per second tidal effects are probably more comparable to another project with a 1 meter per second tidal versus, say, a 4 or 5 meter per second flow. Similarly with waves. And you'll see in these transferability guidelines, we started with what we think is absolutely necessary at the top, down through important to desirable. Okay, next slide, please. Back to our bubbles. I want to talk about this data collection consistency idea. It's probably not possible for Annex IV or anyone to dictate to the world exactly what methods and instruments need to be used to measure these interactions. But I do believe we can strive towards a level of consistency so that we're measuring consistent processes and units and at least providing some advice on instrumentation, ways of both collecting and analyzing the data. The other aspect of this is while the regulator who might look for data sets to compare or transfer isn't responsible for the original quality assurance of data sets, but it's important he or she is aware of what that level of QA is to understand how useful the data are. By striving towards this consistency, we can employ some of the very typical data quality aspects of inquiring whether the data are credible, dependable, confirmable, etc. And these are just some examples of some data collected. These happen to be little clips of data around turbine-like devices. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of data consistency, this might be a little hard to read, and I'm certainly not expecting you will take in the details here. This is still a work in progress. What we have done is for each of those 6 stressors, we have tried to typify the process or measurement tool in the second column. For instance, collision risk, you typically use sensors that are either visual, like video and still photography, and active acoustic sensors like echo sounders, sonar, etc. The reporting units are the next column, and in terms of collision risk, it's the number of visible targets, number of collisions. If we look at underwater noise using hydrophones, the desire would be to have everybody collecting the amplitude in decibels in reference to 1 micropascal at 1 meter, and frequencies at least document whether it's broadband or specific frequency noise, etc. The final column on the right is a brief look at how one might analyze or interpret the data. And this will be posted, and we will continue to work on this with a group of experts. So I would encourage you to take a look at it when you get a chance to look at the slides. Too much detail for right now. Okay, next slide, please. Moving to the last bubble within the bubble. Based on the requests from regulators to be able to find, discover, and use existing data sets from consented and permitted projects, we are developing a monitoring data sets discoverability matrix. We're doing this in collaboration with our colleagues at Aquaterra Limited in Scotland. And we are putting together, think of it as a very large lookup table that includes such things as project size, the stressor and the receptor, what technology is being used, site conditions. And the idea is that we will be able to discover data sets for already permitted or consented projects, looking originally at these marine renewable energy project archetypes. That's how you do the lookup. And that will allow the regulator to find those data sets, to evaluate the information, to look at the level of QA, et cetera. And this will aid in that transferability. The plan is eventually this will be hosted as a lookup table on TESIS. We haven't actually designed that yet, but that's where we're going with this. Okay, next, somebody is looking for the access. Oh, good. Okay, sorry. Okay, next slide, please. Michaela mentioned that when we went to an expert workshop, which was held in June around the International Conference on Ocean Energy in Cherbourg, France, one of the things that we proposed was a set of best management practices. So if you think of this dotted line surrounding this process we have here, this is really the operational side of it. The first and second BMPs really deal with meeting necessary requirements from the guidelines for transferability and ensuring that the data are collected consistently. The third BMP really is our attempt to encourage the regulatory community to use and rely on numerical models for describing these interactions, recognizing that early on for some of these interactions we don't have sufficient data to develop reliable numerical models, but we're getting there. And that as we develop those models, data collection around these devices, around these sites, should be really pointed at providing data to validate or calibrate these models. The fourth BMP is really our desire to further interpret and provide context for data sets. In no way are we suggesting that every permitting application for a tidal project needs to include animal behavioral studies around the turbine. However, if those data are available from research projects or other data collection efforts in the area, we'd really encourage their use to help interpret the data. So that's our set of best management practices. Next slide, please. From here, we are, in fact, developing a implementation plan to carry all this out. And to do that, we've tried to define what is the success of the data transferability process. How would we know if this works, and how would we get there? And we really see that all members of the marine renewable energy community are really important players here. First and foremost, the regulatory community. It's absolutely vital that the regulators come on board with this, accept the premise of data transferability, and are willing to at least try to apply these principles of data transferability and collection consistency as they go forward in permitting new projects. Without them, this process doesn't work, and their feedback to help improve this process, see what works, see what doesn't, is vital. Also, terribly important is device and project developers really understanding the value of this and committing to collecting and providing the data that are consistent with this process, so collected consistently, and also that will fit the framework in a way that the regulators can use those data. The researchers and consultancies, again, these are the vital producers of additional data, and we hope that they will come on board and, again, be willing to collect data in a consistent manner, use these data collected around devices so that the research data they collect is useful for transfer. Okay, next slide, please. So there we are. That's the process very quickly once over. And as I've said before, these slides will be available for you to look at a little better. We've written an implementation plan, and we'll be starting to implement that. And that really consists very strongly of continuing to seek input from the U.S. and other Annex IV countries, the regulators in those countries. We are in the process right now of the other Annex IV countries sort of retracing our steps. They are carrying out or have carried out the survey of regulators in their countries. In each case, those surveys have either been translated or altered a little bit to suit the regulatory community and landscape in that country. There will then be a series of workshops as appropriate in each of those countries, again recognizing that every nation has its own set of laws and rules, processes, relative size, number of regulators, et cetera, but there is enough commonality, we believe, both in the problems being faced trying to move this industry forward, and although laws and regulations differ by country, there are still strong methods that are really very common throughout those. Eventually, this whole process will be on a web-based tool on TEFAS. Another issue that came up during the expert workshop we had in France in June, which we will work towards this coming year, is to convene a virtual group of representatives from across the community to really try to share our understanding of and progress in consenting and permitting projects. Think of it as research updates, new findings, et cetera. We also see that a group like this has other benefits. It will allow us and the Annex IV representatives to provide technical assistance in using this framework and BMPs, and it will allow us to gauge whether this is really working or not. The added benefit is if we can get regulators from different countries to talk with one another, it's not easy for them to travel or to attend conferences, but if there is an easy forum for exchange of ideas, we think this can really help as well. Okay, next slide, please. So the data transferability process links are all up on TEFAS. You see that whole list of things that are there, the white papers that we wrote that, as Michaela mentioned, the copies of some of the complete sets of data we presented, of which Michaela showed you just a little bit. That's up there. Workshop recordings, documents from the workshop we held around ICOE, and that's where we'll also put up today's presentations and recordings. So we encourage you, again, it's just tefas.pnnl.gov data transferability. We encourage you to visit there. Last slide. And this is just our team here and our contact information, Andrea Copping, Michaela Freeman, Alicia Gorton, and we encourage you to reach out to us anytime. We're always looking for feedback. So at this point, what I'd like to do is really encourage you to post any questions in the chat box, and we'll also take some oral questions just in a moment. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Right, and we have our first question. We've been asked to list all of the Annex IV countries. So right now we actually have 15 countries, and I'm going to let Andrea take that away.
I don't know if I can list them all. They are up on, if you go to TEFAS/Annex IV, about Annex IV, but they include, in Asia, they include China, Japan, India, also Australia, North America, Canada, and the U.S., in Europe, the UK, Ireland, France, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Spain, Portugal. I don't know how many that is. It includes South Africa.
And the U.S. And I will note that we just got Australia added to the list, and so there are 15. We will get that updated on TEFAS shortly.
Thanks for the question.
So we have another question here. Are there any thoughts about short-term versus long-term monitoring / data collection, and is this effort primarily focused on short-term data collection collected by the developer?
That's a great question. I'd say yes and yes. I think we're most focused right now on the as you said, the shorter-term data collection that would be required both baseline and post-installation, although some of those data collection efforts could go on for a number of years. We hope that they will be proportionate to what is needed. But you raise a really important question about long-term potential effects, especially when we think of things like cumulative effects, these sort of barrier or displacement effects with migratory species, which could take quite a long time to show up. And we think these are incredibly important. All of Annex IV is very much behind that. We do think that that is probably not the purview of the developer, but more of the national government to ensure that that takes place, so that as we develop this new low-carbon form of energy, there is a real need for the national governments to continue to look at their ocean resources, their living marine resources, and ensure that there isn't damage done. And as we all know, with the shifting baseline of climate change, this becomes even more important. So, yeah, I think it's something that we're very committed to, but it's important to distinguish what's really something the developers need to do versus sort of the national interest.
All right, thank you for that question. We have another question. Have there been regional differences of specific marine renewable energy or marine hydrokinetic devices, or were findings always global? So, for example, tidal turbine that works in Canada but not in Korea.
Great question. You know, we don't really have enough experience yet with these devices to make those kinds of statements, but I think that it is pretty much a given among the developers, in particular the device developers, also project developers, that any device needs to be first and foremost picked and tailored for the location. And in many cases that has to do with the site characteristics, it's got to do with the wave or tidal resource, the depth, the width. And from an environmental perspective, I think that we would really like to see, as those resource characterization and engineering thoughts are taken into account, that the potential risk to marine resources are taken into account. Let me give you an example. A near-shore flap wave device that might work extremely well in a rocky environment might in fact induce significant sediment transport interruptions on a sandy beach environment. So that may not be the best choice there. Similarly, as we learn more about tidal and river turbines and potential risks to marine mammals or fish, we may find certain types of devices or certain devices operated in certain fashions are less risky. And we are hoping very much to be able to do the sort of biological design from the beginning that reduces these risks, so that you take away the need to do a lot more monitoring for the uncertainty and potential mitigation. So I don't think there's anything that's really been found to be country-specific, but certainly each site needs to be examined.
Thank you for that question. One other question, to what extent has transferability been used with any existing permit applications, and has there been any feedback on an initial attempt to use transferred data?
Great question. We have not found any formalized evidence of this. However, in talking with regulators, we have found that many of them do this in an informal manner. They look for similarities, and that's what really grew out of this in the regulators telling us it was very hard for them to find data from already permitted or consented projects, particularly in this country, because we don't have many. So there certainly seems to be this sort of inherent, yes, I want to use these data when I have them. So but one of the things we hope to do in this process is start to document this formally.
And one note on that, when we were talking to regulators in our U.S. regulator workshops, is one regulator in particular offered up that they had been doing a different permitting process. There was no data available, so they actually looked to an analogous industry to be able to transfer such data. So as Andrea mentioned, it's been happening in an informal way, and so we're just trying to put this kind of more consistent steps to it so we can do it for this industry.
Yeah, good point. And I think that very much underscores something we hadn't even thought about in the beginning, was this data set discoverability matrix. This may turn out to be the most important part of this process.
Yeah, thank you for that question. All right, we have a question on whale engagement. It's often raised as an issue. Are there records of entanglements for different types of mooring lines, such as catenary, taut, or other?
Thank you. Whale entanglement, whale encounter, very near and dear to my heart. This has been raised particularly as offshore wind in California has become more and more important. With deep depths and floating platforms, the idea you would have many mooring lines going down through the water column. It's certainly been raised with wave devices in the past, but on a very theoretical basis. There are no examples that we can find of whale entanglement or other deleterious outcomes with mooring lines from any industry using mooring lines. recognizing that whale entanglement, the concerns really come from loose fishing gear and other gear where there's a loose end or a large loop. We did look at catenaries and tension leg devices, taut moorings, with the thought that taut moorings would be safer because they can't loop. But the fact of the matter is no developer will put a catenary out with enough slack to loop, although we draw them as kind of, you know, slack lines. In fact, they've got a lot of tension around them. And the reason I say it's near and dear to my heart is Molly Greer and I have just finished a 3-minute video animation for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that tries to put this whole idea of migratory whales going through a lot of mooring lines in perspective, and that's going to be available very shortly. We showed it at the Ocean Renewable Energy Conference in Portland, Oregon last week, and the upshot of it is the scale of a whale, and we used a adult humpback and calf pair, so big whales. They are very, very tiny in compared to these mooring lines, and therefore even less likely to have that ability to get entangled in them.
Thank you for that question. All right, we have another one. Do agencies keep a log or database of data or information internal to the agencies? Is this what they're looking for related to data, and do they know to look to TSIS?
Great question. When we spoke to regulators, we did find they tended to look within their own agencies for their own experience, as Michaela has said, to analogous industries, because there hasn't been, at least in the U.S., that much experience with permitting marine renewables. Most of the regulators we've engaged with, if they didn't know about TSIS before, they certainly do now. And we do find that most of the regulators, the federal regulators in the U.S., and we find quite broadly abroad, are aware of TSIS. We found when we worked with U.S. state regulators who are engaged in many other different kinds of processes, they knew less about it, but we were able to introduce a great many of them to it, and we continue to be, as many of you probably know, fairly aggressive in our outreach about TSIS.
Thank you for that question. And we have another question. So is there a body that can provide a neutral review of environmental assessment applications?
Before official regulators are involved. There is not a body per se. It's a great idea and a great thought, and I'm not sure where exactly you're coming from with that, but if there is a developer who is creating an environmental assessment, we would thoroughly encourage you, first and foremost, to work closely with the regulators who will be accepting it, because it can really reduce the pain on everybody's part if there's a really strong understanding of what is needed. And we hope that this process can be a means of discussion, a means to bring together on common ground with the regulator and the developer beforehand. I would further encourage you that there are, in many cases, university researchers or consultants who are working very, very closely in this industry who can provide that kind of overview for you before it goes to the regulator. But really, it's the regulator. Get to know your regulators. They're good people, and they want to do this properly. And if it's a matter of both the developer and the regulator learning together, we think that's a really great thing.
Thanks for that question. And then we'll just go back to the final slide just to give you guys our email addresses once more before we sign off here. So, all right, as there are no more questions, we don't want to take too much of your time. So we just want to, again, thank you guys for joining us here. Please do look at this process on TSIS. Feel free to email any of us with any questions or comments. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.